Welcome to Unraveling Behavior, a science podcast from the Max Planck Institute for Human Development. Hello, everyone. Today, we're tackling a big question. Is digital media hurting democracy? We hear a lot about the risks of social media, but internet companies still say the evidence isn't clear. In this episode, we'll clear up the debate by discussing solid scientific evidence on how digital media are changing our political views and actions. Joining us is Dr. Lisa Oswald, a computational social scientist here at the Max Planck Institute for Human Development. Lisa has a PhD in political science and is an expert on public discourse in online environments, including political polarization and online hate speech. We'll be discussing an impactful study Lisa worked on with Philipp Lorenz Spreen, Stefan Lewandowski, and Ralf Hertwig that was published in the journal Nature Human Behavior last year. They have reviewed and consolidated evidence from hundreds of scientific studies on digital media and democracy, having uncovered both beneficial and detrimental effects. And now, let's hear directly from Dr. Lisa Oswald. Lisa, thank you so much for joining us today. It's truly an honor to have you on the podcast.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
A good place for us to start our discussion today could be to talk about the reasons why digital media have this potential to erode democracy in ways that the traditional media like TV, the radio, newspapers generally do not. So what is different about them?
Yeah, good question to start with. I would say, of course, they share a lot of features. Both traditional and digital media provide information for public discourse, and also newspapers have to be sold and read by people in order to keep their business running. But with digital media, and I would now say especially social media, we see some structures that are, I would say, really fundamentally different. So the first thing is, of course, the new prevalence of user-generated content. So pretty much everybody can produce content, put it online, publish things. And so we are moving from this traditional one-to-many communication situation with traditional media, right, like journalists putting things together, publishers publishing things, now to a that's called many-to-many communication dynamic, which is complicating things and also takes away this previous gatekeeper function. And so basically nobody is systematically fact-checking things before things go online. And then we also have usually the shortening of formats, right? Like a tweet is much, much shorter than a newspaper article. And also short videos on TikTok are very different from like documentaries in television.
And when you mentioned that there's nobody fact-checking the content that people published on social media, it's also that the information just spreads too quickly for fact-checkers or responsible journalists to have time to even do that.
Exactly, especially like the overall volume of information is just at an unprecedented scale now. Mm-hmm.
Is perhaps the issue of personalized content also a problem?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, through algorithms that sort of try to cater to this attention economy, they sort of tailor feeds to people to make it even more likely that people stay engaged, that people stay on platforms, consume more content, right? So we have a personalization of information. So not everybody sees the same information and has the same basis for discourse in the end.
And it's even a personalization, since we are comparing it to traditional media, that is really beyond the scope of your awareness, right? Because you could say, well, I watch these news channel because I like it or because it confirms with my views of the world. But if I want to get these other type of news, there is this other channel. So there is at least a conscious choice of what to consume. But with social media, you're just less aware of what's filtered and how.
Yeah, and absolutely. And I think you're pointing to a super important phenomenon, because I would say on the one hand, you have a huge diversification of sources and content producers. So you can find someone who is sort of producing content that is exactly what you want to read. But on the other hand, you also have like a very interesting pattern of centralization, because the platforms hosting the content are, of course, huge and also very intransparent to governance or democratic oversight.
Yeah, it just seems, I mean, I don't know if it's correct to put it in these terms, please tell me, but it seems a bit like there's just this constellation of risk factors that make a negative outcome for democracy likely.
Yeah, I would say like the negativity of the outcome is precisely why we did the study, because we wanted to see what is actually overwhelming, or how is this complex landscape looking like. But of course, it's extremely difficult to draw one bottom line and one outcome in the end. And as you say, right, like both the media landscape, which now consists of online and offline sources, as well as democracy overall, is just like maybe like two of the most complex phenomena you could try to study.
Could you tell us about the main question that your study aimed to address and why?
Yeah, I mean, if you wanted as a research question, we were asking so whether or to what extent and in which context digital media has or may have detrimental effects to democracy. And this was sort of a two-stage question. First, it was generally the question, how do directions of association look like? Is it predominantly detrimental or beneficial when you look at different political outcomes? We can go into a bit more detail later. And also then, of course, to explore this across political contexts, because we're not talking about effects on democracy, but also like the world does not consist of just democracies. And also I would say that the hypotheses that we were just talking about are fundamentally in discussion or under discussion in established democracies.
Now, talking about the methods that you used in your study, you used a systematic literature review to uncover the details of this relationship between digital media and democracy. Could you explain what systematic literature review is and why you opted for this approach instead of doing a brand new original study, for example? Why did you opt for this methodology?
Very good question. So I would say, given the state of the current debate, or the debate at the time when we sort of designed the study, it was very clear that we want to be very systematic about this, because this field of evidence is just so big and so complex. And if, like, no matter which position you take, so for example, let's say you are in a regulatory position, and your position is that you want to regulate digital media, you could find a number of studies that support your position. And if you're a tech company, you could also just find a number of papers that support your position. So I would say that in this field of evidence, it's not this one study that can sort of answer the question whether digital media is a threat to democracy. That's completely impossible. So I would say that this field really learns through evidence accumulation, and we need evidence accumulation and then also synthesis in some way. But it was very clear that a classic meta-analysis where you would take statistical coefficients. So what is the correlation between those two variables and other variables in different studies, and synthesizing those values, those numerical values, that this will not be possible in this field, because measurement and variables and definitions of variables were just so heterogeneous and diverse. So you can just imagine that there were, of course, lots of surveys that surveyed often also representative samples, or like at least very large samples in different countries. But then you have survey self-reports of let's say, online news consumption and support for populists or something like this. And then you have, on the other hand, behavioral measures of how people interact with online interfaces, or you have a sample of 2 million tweets. And how would you compare those like 2,000 survey responses to those 2 million tweets and the coefficients that are derived from such studies? So it was, it was unfortunately completely, impossible to do a meta-analysis. So we said, okay, we take the thing in the middle, the systematic review, and try to sort of structure the field of evidence as good as we can.
So now that we're going into the details of your study, I'd like to ask you to perhaps define, in the context of the study, what you mean by digital media. We've also used the term social media so far in our conversation, and also democracy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, defining democracy, maybe to start with the latter, is, I would say, also a $1 million question in itself. And it's, of course, a very multifaceted concept that cannot be measured as well with something, right? You cannot, there is no thermometer to put on a country to say, okay, today democracy looks better or worse. But usually how it's done is that it's sort of broken into different facets and different dimensions. We just said, okay, we are interested in different variables, outcome variables, political outcome variables that can be, like, broadly speaking, be categorized in either being perceived as detrimental to democracy or beneficial to democracy. So broadly speaking, an informed public is something that is necessary for democracy to function. So political knowledge is one of those outcome variables that is sort of in the sort of positive box. And then, political polarization especially if you look at affective polarization, having sort of very negative perceptions of the political outgroup that goes beyond the mere opinions. This can be a threat to democracy or is previously regarded as definitely detrimental to democracy. Same with misinformation, hate speech, populism. So, of course, that's more like a cyclographic split between variables. But yeah, this is how we went about systematizing all the outcome variables that we see in this landscape. And then, talking about digital media, I would say we took a very broad approach. So any type of medium that is hosted via the internet and accessed via the internet counted. So we did, for example, not include traditional TV news or printing press. But for example, of course, we have social media, which is one category of digital media. And of course, I would say a very important one in this discourse and also in this field. But also the online outlets of newspapers counted as digital medium. A podcast would be a digital medium.
So, and in the systematic review, as you're saying, you could not analyze how large the observed effects are, but you could still look at the direction of the effects, right? You could still look at the literature and say, in this paper, is the association between consumption of digital media and a certain political variable, is this beneficial or is it detrimental? So this you could still do.
Exactly, because we only included, of course, original empirical evidence. So those were all quantitative studies that gathered data, analyzed data, and came up with some form of estimate of association or effect.
One important analysis in your study is that you examined both correlational and causal evidence. Could you please help us understand the difference between these two types of evidence, perhaps using an example, and why you looked at both? Why was this important?
Yeah, absolutely. So correlation generally, and I would say that this is the vast majority of studies that we had in our sample, those studies, they observe variables, they measure variables, such as, for example, social media use, maybe even as people self-reported, how many times per day, per week do you use social media? And they measure a different variable. In our context, an outcome variable could be political opinions or something like political extremism on a scale, right? And then you have those two variables, and a positive association or positive correlation in that sense would mean that if you have high values on one variable, so if you use social media a lot, then this would imply that you should also have high values on the other, right? Like that your maybe political extremism is also high, right? And the same for low values, right? So, but this is, a statistical observational finding, this correlation. And this could also be explained by third variables, right? So this does not necessarily have to mean that social media use causes political extremism. No means, right? There could also be a variable, and I'm just making this up. That is maybe unemployment or having too much time, right? Which causes you to use social media a lot. You have a lot of time, and also maybe you are unsatisfied with your life, and this is why you're becoming politically extreme, right? And then also it could all go in the other direction, right? Also, just because you're so extreme, you use social media because you don't have any trust in established media anymore, right? So correlations are a statistical pattern, but cannot really tell what is cause and what is effect, or whether there are third variables. And this is, I would say, pretty much how this field looks like, right? It is extremely difficult to get causal evidence, right? Because if you want to prove that one variable causes the other, you usually need an experiment, and you have to randomly assign the cause variable. So you would, in this context, you would have to randomly assign people to use social media or not, or use it more or use it less, and then measure the outcome. And of course, if you just think about research designs, right? Like how does this work? Pretty much everyone uses social media, so you can't say, oh, now I just take all those people who've never engaged with social media, and then I take one group, and people are randomly assigned to both groups, and then I just take one group and say, now use social media, and we see what happens, right? If like this sample would be a very weird sample, probably like 85-year-olds and 5-year-olds. So this doesn't make sense. And I would say the most prominent approach to do this, to try to get down to causality, are with social media use, if that's your treatment variable or your cause, is to do deactivation experiments. So you take a sample, a group of people, and you randomly assign one group to a condition in which you should deactivate, let's say, your Facebook account or your Instagram account for 6 weeks, and the other group can just continue using it. And this way you can sort of understand what the causal effect of the deactivation is, which is already like a big step.
So in your literature review, you were able to uncover nearly 500 articles. How did you search for all these articles? How did you select them? How was that process?
Basically, how you start this entire process is you have a research question, right? Like what's the impact or what's the link between digital media and democracy? And then you design a search query that contains different keywords. So for us, of course, those were keywords about different types of digital media. Then you have a set of keywords about different elements of democracy and the outcome variables that we were interested in. And because we were like really focused on original empirical evidence, not other conceptual theoretical papers, we also had a set of keywords about methods, so something like survey, experiment, and then you have this big query, and you run it just like you would in any search engine. You run it on big databases, and we did this on Web of Science and Scopus, and then you have a big list of articles.
We were saying that your analysis had these 2 stages, right? First, you analyzed the full set of correlational evidence, and after that, you focused on the subset of articles that also reported causal evidence. And perhaps before we go into the details of your findings, you could just summarize, whether these two analyses converged more or less. How did things look like?
I would actually say, like broadly speaking, we could just say they mostly converged. At least there was no systematic pattern of one looking very different than the other.
But there's still a difference in the amount of evidence.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, it was a very, very small subset of causal evidence. And I mean, also there, we didn't replicate those studies, right? We also just went with the authors' conclusions, and probably also there were instances of not perfect causal inference in the end. So I would really say, like the bottom line of this entire study is that causal evidence is extremely rare.
So then, let's talk about the main effects. Say what you actually found. What were the main effects of digital media on democracy? Do you want to start with the beneficial effects or the detrimental ones?
Yeah, I'd say start with a positive, right? So, and actually, it's even the most researched outcome variable, namely political participation. And here I also have to say, right, participation very broadly defined. This could be voting in elections, but it could also, of course, be protest participation, and then also many forms of online participation. So, signing an online petition, for example, like this is all different forms of political participation. We found, or the papers that we reviewed found largely positive associations. So the more use of digital media in various forms, the higher political participation. So it actually, I would say illustrates the early hypothesis that the internet has a big enabling function for citizenship and for democratic participation. And I found it also interesting because, again, looking at political regime heterogeneity, most studies in the democracies looked at voting, and in the authoritarian and emerging democracies, authoritarian context, people and researchers mostly looked at protest participation. So also very different phenomena, I would say. But still, like in both contexts, there were predominantly positive associations.
But there were also detrimental ones, right?
So one that was a bit surprising to us, even because we didn't have the variable of trust explicitly in our keywords. Trust in government, in politics, in democratic institutions. It could also be trust in mainstream media. For example, in Germany, there could be trust in public broadcasting, but mostly trust in institutions. This variable is, of course, super important, but we didn't have the word trust in the original search query, but it came out quite a bit. So people were researching this phenomenon quite a bit, and so we also had it as a category then in the outcomes, and there were really like largely detrimental associations visible. Also some causal evidence in this field. But of course, here I would really, again, like to emphasize the political context, right? So like if I lose trust in functioning democratic institutions in a democracy, then that's, of course, a somewhat worrying sign for democracy. But if you live in an autocracy, then losing trust in a dictatorship or in the institutions, or, for example, state-controlled media, then, of course, this is the first step towards democratization. So even though we find, like, mostly detrimental associations, of course, like, keeping context in mind here is really important.
And then there is also political polarization.
Yeah, I think this is probably the one that I'm asked about the most, I would say. And yes, we find mostly detrimental associations. between digital media use and political polarization. But here I would also say it's mostly correlational evidence. So pretty much I already brought this example when talking about correlation versus causation, right? So here from the literature that we see in this review, we cannot really say, is it really digital media making people more polarized, or whether it's rather polarized people being more active on social media, right? So this direction of causality is still quite unclear, or at least at the time of writing was not so clear. And now, as already more evidence accumulates in the very recent past, I would say that it becomes more and more visible that it is more difficult to actually causally identify the effect of social. Now I'm saying social media on political polarization, especially affective polarization, not so much issue polarization, but the opposite direction is quite visible in different types of data. So basically, this selection effect that the more extreme you are in your attitude towards the political outgroup, the more active you are in voicing this opinion. Also, the more toxic you are in voicing this opinion, and this sort of comes together in a very skewed content production mechanism, right? So that social media and discussions on social media that you can see as an ordinary citizen, or that everybody can see, are really just no representative image of public discourse or public opinion. It's really, the vast majority of content that you can see there is produced by a small minority of very active and oftentimes also, quite radical individuals. At least this is my reading of the literature. However, I would also say that the interpretation of this diverges quite a bit in public discourse as well, because you could, if let's say I'm a tech company and I would just say, see, like, it's not us, like, we are not polarizing people. It's just the people who are crazy who come here and voice their opinion, and that's the world. And maybe, that's correct. But I would still say this phenomenon of this selection effect and this skewed representation of public discourse is really like ground for concern, because we are very much social beings, right? We don't form our political opinions in a vacuum. This does not come out of us somehow, but we also just observe our social environment, right? And we see, okay, what is being said in public? How do people speak about certain issues? What is the tone when discussing certain political issues? So and I would say there are just so many feedback loops in many different directions. So it's very difficult to disentangle cause from effect, and also to identify the boundaries of causal effects here.
You were saying that most of the evidence you found is correlational, that there's not enough causal evidence about this link between digital media and democracy, and that you found both beneficial positive effects and detrimental ones. The most positive effect you found was in terms of digital media increasing political participation, and on the negative side there's decreasing trust in governments and institutions, and there is also increasing political polarization. So these are the two negative effects that you've observed. Talking more specifically about different parts of the world, where did you observe more beneficial effects and more detrimental effects?
That the most beneficial effects were found in the autocratic regimes and emerging democracies. But I would also say, of course, what this heterogeneity shows, and even if we would say this is all causal evidence, those are all flawless studies, of course, this also shows the selection of research questions by researchers, right? So let's say if you are concerned about the political landscape in the US right now. And also I have to say that the US evidence is really overrepresented in the sample. There's still like a big range of different countries that were included in the review. But yeah, there's a lot of papers that are published in the US. And if you just look at this phenomenon and also maybe see how research funding is distributed, you can see that there's a focus on the detrimental effects of digital media on democracy in democracies, right? Because also funders are concerned about the state of democracy, and this is why we decide to also examine this in more detail. And and maybe in autocratic countries, and now here I'm like hypothesizing, but maybe especially some of the early studies were looking at the sort of enabling functions of the internet for organizing protests, for finding regime-critical information, and also enabling anonymous participation, for example, to reduce the risk.
I think it ties nicely to some of the research done here at our institute that shows that if you really want to understand the mechanisms behind human behavior, that you really need to look at our surroundings.
Yeah, very much. Yeah, and also not just the political context, but also, of course, the media system. They are just so different in different countries, and of course they also have past trajectories. Sort of the established traditional media also sort of have their legacy in the online world, right? For example, in the US, you have like more like a two-party system, and you also have quite a polarized media system, whereas in multi-party systems such as Germany, you also have, and we also have public broadcasting, right, which is completely different. And public broadcasting also has online outlets now, and also has social media channels. There's like just huge complexity, and also I think the history in the political sense and in the media sense. Yeah, this is why I said, it's very difficult to simulate in a lab.
Given the state of the evidence, what we're saying, that there's not so much causal evidence, most of it is correlational. Do you think it is still right for digital media platforms to say the science is not settled?
Yeah, so I would say our review probably pretty clearly showed that we know more than nothing, right? It's not that there is a blank slate and we think that there is just no link between, let's say, social media use and democratic outcomes. I think this is off the table, I would say, and I think this was already before that off the table. It is very unclear precisely what the mechanism is and what the scale of the effect is, right? So I think there we need more. But then also on the other hand, I'm also oftentimes a bit wondering, and I mean that's definitely a political question and not my question to answer, but I'm just wondering, so what is the null hypothesis? Like, do we have to be certain that there's absolutely no harm to sort of not act, or the opposite, right?
Like how much harm do you need to document?
Yeah, exactly. And so I think this debate is quite skewed by very powerful actors. And I mean, there's already action been taken, right? The European Digital Services Act is, I think, a very good step in the first direction, especially to increase transparency. It also should ensure, if this all works out now, researcher access to digital platform data. So we should maybe now have a better or an easier time to actually demonstrate such causal effects. This does not, and by no means, mean that we can now run experiments on platforms to demonstrate causal evidence. And then again, we have this problem. But still, we should probably be able to just continue research on demonstrating also associations. Yeah.
And when you mentioned the issue of transparency, is that also transparency towards the users themselves?
Yeah, both. Yeah. Like to individuals to sort of enable more choices, and maybe also, so for example, to say, hey, I want to have just the chronological feed. I don't want to have any personalized advertisement. I don't want to have personalized content, but just the people that I follow in reverse chronological order, full stop. And some already offer this. But yeah, having more autonomy as an individual is of course one thing. But then, of course, I think that also many decisions are political in nature and more like systemic and cannot be given to the individual. The individual cannot take responsibility for many like meta effects, I would say. And so this is what I mean with transparency, that sort of we as researchers can do research in a good way to understand what are like more macroscopic patterns and to then inform policymakers on where they should take action. One thing that I always like to emphasize regarding individual social media use is to sort of understand the dynamics, like on a meta level. For example, the skewed nature of content production, right? So that I'm, as a regular individual user, that I understand that what I'm seeing on a social media platform is not representative of public opinion, but that people who post there have very different of course, interests and motivations to post things there, but they are probably not the average individual, and that I can take this into account when reflecting on my own personal political opinion. And I would say this comes down to digital literacy, right? Understanding that there are more and less trustworthy sources, and understanding dynamics of content production. I would say, if you think about those issues such as fact-checking, it's also super hard to put this responsibility on the individual user to, fact check every single piece of information that you see somewhere. So I think also, content moderation policies have to be negotiated in some way, and at best also informed by research, which is a very difficult thing to do, both in terms of misinformation and also in terms of online hate speech, of course.
Lisa, thank you so much for joining us today, taking the time to share your knowledge. It's been a pleasure having you.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
Dear audience, thanks so much for tuning in to today's discussion with Dr. Lisa Oswald. For show notes and other resources concerning this episode, check out our website at unravelingbehavior.org. We don't make any money from this podcast. Our mission is solely to make scientific knowledge accessible to everyone. So if today's conversation with Dr. Lisa Oswald resonated with you, please share this episode. It's a simple way to help us bring scientific knowledge to more people. Thanks for your support and your interest in science. See you soon.